Good afternoon and welcome to today's IJA's Roundtable reporting on the Native vote. The discussion will focus on the power of the Native vote and encourage journalists to report ethically on Indigenous communities and issues without relying on stereotypes. Panelists will focus on the impact Native American voters have in national elections, particularly in key swing states, and discuss voting rights for broader public understanding. Attendees will have the opportunity to learn from experts about their experience reporting in Indian country and the resources they utilize. This webinar is being recorded, and the recorded video will be available on the IJA website and YouTube channel. This roundtable series would not be possible without the generous support of our sponsors, the Ford Foundation, the Knight Foundation, the Democracy Fund, and the Google News Initiative. We thank all of them for their continued support. Our panel moderator for today is IJA Board President Christine Trudeau. Christine may take questions from the audience as time allows, and please use the Q&A option at the bottom of the Zoom window to submit any questions. And Christine can take it away.
Thank you. I just wanted to take a quick moment to thank Justine, our program manager for IJA. She was instrumental in putting this roundtable webinar together for us today. So thank you, Justine, and just give everybody a chance to clap. So I wanted to just start off with a quick introduction. We only have an hour today, so I want to make sure that we do get to everybody's questions. Huge turnout, so very, very excited, very happy. So first, I'll start with Polly Jeanette Claw. She's a citizen of the Navajo Nation and an award-winning journalist from Gallup, New Mexico. She's worked with the Navajo Times, the Texas Observer, covering Indigenous communities, and her radio pieces have aired on KYAT, National Native News, NPR's Latino USA, and Texas Public Radio. She's a former board member of the Indigenous Journalists Association and is based in Washington, D.C., where she is ICT's, formerly known as Indian Country Today's, political correspondent. Welcome, Polly.
Hi, thank you all so much for having me.
April Ignacio is from the Tohono O'odham Nation. She is the co-founder member of the Indivisible Tohono, a grassroots community-based organization that provides opportunities for civic engagement beyond voting. She is the vice chair for the Arizona Democratic Party and was appointed by the governor of Arizona, Katie Hobbs, to serve on the Arizona state's Missing Murdered Indigenous Peoples Task Force. Welcome, April.
Skikdash, thank you for having me.
And last but definitely not least, Shondine Silversmith. She's an award-winning journalist from the Navajo Nation and who has been covering Indigenous affairs for over 14 years. She is currently focused on covering Arizona's 22 federally recognized tribal nations. Her stories have appeared in local and national news publications across the country. Silversmith has earned a master's degree in journalism from Northwestern University in Boston and is pursuing her PhD at the Arizona State University. She is an active member of the Indigenous Journalists Association and is committed to amplifying Indigenous voices and storytelling throughout journalism. She has made it a point in her career to advocate, pitch, and produce stories about Indigenous communities in every newsroom she's worked in. Welcome, Shondine.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me.
And now we'll start with our prepared questions on the power, reporting on the power of the Native vote. And I wanted to start with a question that goes to all of our panelists, and we'll just kind of do one by one. So we'll start backwards with Shondine on the influence of the Native vote on elections. So how would you define the power of the Native vote? Shondine.
Thank you for that question. So I've covered elections before, and I've covered the Native vote for a really long time. And it's always interesting when people talk about it and try to understand it because it's complicated. First of all, there's really no way to track the Native vote because a majority of Indigenous people live in urban areas, but also because the only way that voting numbers are tracked is through the precincts that they vote in. And you cannot identify that every single person that votes within those precincts are Native. So that's why it's complicated, which is why it's often left up to grassroots organizations to connect with their communities to understand what Native voting is and why it's important. They're the ones that are educating their communities and educating these voters about why it's important to vote, and especially explaining what policies and propositions and candidate stances are on these ballots, because within a lot of Indigenous communities, especially rural Indigenous communities, they don't openly have access to that information. So when it comes to thinking about the Native vote and thinking about the power of Native vote, you have to understand that it's not monolithic. It is complicated. There are a lot of different forms of voting within Indigenous communities, but also Native people are all over the place. We are in major cities, we are in rural communities, we are in Washington, in Phoenix, in San Francisco, we are all over the place. And we obviously vote based on what matters to our communities. And you can see that in the way that a lot of the way that these communities vote. I mean, in 2020, it was proven when you look at the voting precinct maps, you can clearly see which direction these Indigenous communities were leaning when they casted their ballots in 2020. And so when reporters are looking to write about Indigenous communities or write about the Native vote, that's something that they have to understand. It's not a quick story. It's not something that you can expect to just kind of come in and fully understand and be like, these are the statistics behind Native voting, because you're going to be disappointed. You're not going to get that. It's complicated, and it's very I think it's important that people pay attention to it, because even though there are over 570 federally recognized tribes, there are huge Indigenous populations within these states where voting is being tracked. And an example of that is in Arizona. So when you think about Native voting, you have to understand that there are different ways to look at it, and there are different things that factor into what makes the Native vote powerful.
And I think in terms of being a grassroots organizer, someone who is already like, that's basically, all that we do, I think nothing for us without us. So we talk about the power of Native vote, we talk about nothing for us without us. So I think when we're, on the ground and we're connecting the dots for voters, for potential voters, not everyone is, co-signing to legislation that is coming through, but I think it's important that constituents understand how it impacts them and how it impacts the future. So I'll give you a really good example. In 2020, Deb Haaland became the first first Native Congresswoman. And then from there, she became the Department Secretary of Interior. And so then she became, Madam Secretary. And I think about the power of the Native vote for, number one, her being elected into office and then being selected as a cabinet member. That's the power of the Native vote. And so there are things that are happening all year round where laws change, things change, they're constantly changing. So it's important that when journalists are, covering the beat, that they understand how connecting the dots to real issues that impact not just Native voters, but constituents, and that it's accurate and that it's fair. And because Natives are a vulnerable population that's constantly under attack. And so when you see how states, counties, we'll start local, right? So we see how counties and then state manipulate the legislation to impact marginalized communities. Those communities are oftentimes communities of color, Black and brown people, and then Natives are, you know, the 1% that are impacted. So which means that because they are on the lower scale, that means they're going to be impacted the hardest. And so all of those things in terms of the power of the Native vote is exactly how what our future would look like, with us or without us. And I think that it's important to have Natives in these spaces because we bring a different perspective. We do things differently. For me, because I'm on the Potawatomi Nation, you know, we concentrate specifically on our tribe to turn out vote because we understand how powerful it is when we have, you know, those 3,000 voters who are collectively voting in one direction. And that though, and we've got some dangerous candidates, right? And so if we have dangerous candidates on the ballot and people are not informed, or they don't have access to newspapers, they don't have access to their mail, they don't have, and they're traveling from large distances in remote areas, we recognize how much more impactful that is to be able to connect those dots. So in terms of, you know, Native vote and the power of the Native vote, I think it comes down to nothing for us without us.
And I feel like I'm a little bit different in all of this because I'm from McKinley County in New Mexico. It's where I was born and raised. I grew up in Gallup, New Mexico. And I feel like I grew up knowing that the Native vote was very powerful and influential. And there were candidates from all across New Mexico who came to Gallup, who come to our intertribal ceremonial, who are at our parades, who are there doing meet and greets on the Navajo Nation and meeting Navajo voters from my community. And so locally as well, like when it comes to local seats, I have always seen Indigenous candidates running for everything from like county commissioner to local like energy commissions. And so I really grew up understanding like how important our vote can be in these elections, and that they're very critical by the way that folks were campaigning in my area all the time. And so one of the things that I do want to highlight is that Senator Tester, Senator Murkowski, Representative Peltola, and Biden winning Arizona have all been attributed to the power of the Native vote and how influential the voting bloc is in these areas. And there are really, really tight races. The races are so marginally thin now that even just 10,000 new voters can win elections. And an example of this is New Mexico's Congressional District 2, where there is an Indigenous candidate, Yvette Harrell, running against Gabe Vasquez. And that election is decided by 1,200 votes, 1,200 to 1,400 votes every single election cycle. And so if you can get 2,000 new registered voters who are from, Mescalero Apache, who are from Zuni Pueblo, that are all located within Congressional District 2, then you can easily, win that election. And so the Native vote is extremely influential. It's extremely powerful. And I think it is also important to note that in the city of New York, like there are more Indigenous people who live in New York City than live on the Navajo Nation. And I just want to put that into perspective for people that Native people are everywhere. We vote everywhere and we make a difference in all 50 states and in all elections. And with races that are so narrow and so marginally thin, the Native vote can decide elections. And I also just wanted to highlight as well, when we're talking about the Native vote, is Indigenous candidates. And so this election cycle, ICT and Advanced Native Political Leadership were able to track 246 Indigenous candidates. 115 of them are Democrats, 28 are Republican, and 94 are listed as nonpartisan on their ballots. And so that again just shows sort of the political influence that we've been having. That is I think I did the math correctly. It's like 130, over 130% increase from 2018 Indigenous candidates, since Deb Haaland was elected in 2018. So just wanted to share that.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, I just dropped that link from ICT's website in there as well into the chat. I think that's getting to everybody, but Justine, let me know if everybody's seeing that. I think that's a good segue into talking about what should people know about understanding Native American voting rights when we're talking about this kind of impact. I'm going to kick it back to you, Polly.
Yeah, so when we're talking about Native American voting rights, it is under attack. People do see the power and influence of the Native vote, and you see that in places like, I think it's either North or South Dakota, where they're breaking up the Native vote into 3 different districts. And they're doing that intentionally to dilute the power of the Native vote. We saw that in San Juan County, Utah, where they were diluting the power of the Navajo vote in that area. And so there are efforts to do that. Oh my gosh, Arizona Congressional District 2. There's another great example of the gerrymandering that tends to happen, alleged gerrymandering that tends to happen when the Native vote is at play, because Native voters do tend to vote Democrat. And so there are efforts, whether it's tribal IDs, whether it's invalidating tribal IDs to be able to register to vote, having real IDs that require residential addresses. And for folks like me, I live like a mile past milepost 6 in like Crystal, New Mexico. And that was the address that like I had to go to rural addressing for. And so those are some of the barriers that happen. In order for me to get like my New Mexico state driver's license, I had to drive all over from Window Rock to my chapter house over to a different chapter house to try to get my rural address. And, there are not many people who are able to take the day off of work to be able to do that labor. And so there's a really, really great report by the Native American Rights Fund. I always say the name wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's barriers at every turn. And that report lists that everything from registering to vote all the way to casting your ballots, there are barriers for Native voters. And no matter like not having enough polling places, not having enough places to be able to register to vote, requiring that people come in person. And so there are just such a number of obstacles for Native voters to overcome, and yet they continue to overcome them. And I think a really great example is Nevada. Nevada has created a voting ecosystem where they work collectively and collaboratively to overcome a lot of the barriers that exist for Native voters. And so I think that is a great example of what you can do to increase voter engagement, and also how you overcome some of these barriers, especially because Nevada is such a rural state, and a lot of their Native nations are located in northern Nevada, and they've been able to work with the state to be able to provide more polling locations, drop off boxes for voting, working with CHRs to be able to get to some other folks. So
yeah, that report was called Obstacles at Every Turn, from NARF, the Native American Rights Fund. But I think what we, some of the things, the challenges specifically for Natives is that it stems back generations. So it's not like something that is happening in this last election cycle or the last two election cycles. Like, this has been happening for generations, multiple generations. And so, I mean, we just celebrated the 100th year of being a citizen of the United States of 1924. And then in 1928, two Hill River Indian community residents tried to sue the Pinal County to register to vote. And this was 1928. And they were unsuccessful. And then I think about like how, we talk about like the obstacles, and then we recognize how the state impacts Natives, but it's not just the state, it starts at the counties, and recognizing how gerrymandering plays a large role in those obstacles, and how Natives can vote, and how they vote, and what is accessible to them. So we understand the how difficult it is, but we're also talking about, with even in the last 4 years, there's been so many different laws that are introduced in the state to hinder individuals' right to vote. I mean, so much so that there's a congressional bill specifically protecting tribal IDs so that they can be utilized for the right to vote. I mean, so we think about how, Polly, you talked about the privilege of growing up in New Mexico and having access to Natives who are engaged, and, and that's not everywhere though, right? So we know that we don't see a large number of representation for Native Americans, people who understand how difficult it is, and they understand the rural addresses and how those addresses impact whether or not we get to vote. And so like in 2022, two young people from the Potawatomi Nation had to sue the state of Arizona for their right to vote. The law that was being introduced was that if you didn't have a physical address, you would then not be allowed to vote. These minors, these young people, Keanu Stevens, who's from Guoidak, and Alana Siqueiros, who is from Gomchgudawawasik, she's from Cells. They sued the state of Arizona on behalf of the Potawatomi Nation to protect the rural vote, to protect those people who utilize a highway contract, to protect individuals who use a P.O. box, to protect those people who have a physical address of milepost 7, 53, 53rd house in Coatfields Village. This is like a direct attack on where we live, and it's not our fault. I think that's the other thing too, that we have to remind ourselves and each other and everybody else listening that it's not our fault. That the systems are set up specifically to target the Native vote. And I think that because we understand how gerrymandering works, how in every 10 years we can pretty much, once that census starts kicking around in our communities, that if we're not counted, this is the prime opportunity for gerrymandering to happen in our communities when we're not counted through the census. The census is what set up the maps, all the voting maps, and how we're going to, you know, navigate through the world in the next 10 years. When we don't take those things seriously, when we don't know who sits on those boards and what their values are and how they're going to impact us, that impacts our future. So it's something that, you know, I think that your case in New Mexico is very, very different than it is in Arizona. And I think that a lot of communities in Arizona, I don't think that I don't think that they're asleep. I just think that we are the sleeping giant. And I also think that that's the power of the Native vote, that we are the sleeping giant. So we look at, you know, there's 300,000 eligible Native voters in the state of Arizona. And we average maybe 10% on during elections, right? The power of that would be so like astonishing, because I look back at the last election with the Arizona State Attorney General. That race was won with 300 votes. 300 votes. So if Native communities, 300 people in Native communities are not voting, that would have been the deciding factor for this one very, very important election where we have actual election deniers on the ballot. And so I think I always go back to connecting the dots and how constituents and individuals understand that we cannot be one issue voters. One issue cannot keep us from voting. And there are a lot of things that are happening nationally that we don't necessarily agree with, we don't co-sign to, and we're not okay with. Being civically engaged is doing one step more than casting your ballot. It's asking questions. It's finding out who's running, you know, and having that conversation. It's something that I talk about all of the time, is that matriarchs, people in our own families, have a better chance of turning out the Native vote than me doing a presentation about how candidates impact us. Having an authentic, I hate that word, authentic, having a real conversation with somebody about like being afraid. That's the other thing too, is like, I'm tired of operating out of fear. And so what we try, you know, we have to recognize that we're not going to change things in one election cycle, that it has to be, you know, we have to be in it for the long game. And so, you know, we don't operate out of fear. We operate out of love for our community and what we want for our community. And so making sure that we're building relationships, making sure that we're having honest conversations in our community, if we elect someone or if we just maybe decide not to vote, how that impacts us. In Arizona, you know, women's healthcare, women's rights are on the ballot. And so like, I think about how that will impact a lot of individuals who maybe just decide to sit this one out because of national politics. I think that's the most frightening part of election cycles, is wanting to make sure that we're providing as much information to potential voters, and that we're being serious about how our communities could be and will be impacted. And, you know, like, I live in Arizona. Arizona is a swing state. Arizona is going to decide who sits, you know, who becomes the president of the United States. So it's something that our team, we take very seriously, because we know how we know the stakes. We know what the stakes are. We know that Social Security is on the line. We know that Medicaid, Medicare is on the line. We know that public education is on the line. We know, and all of those things impact the working class, the families, families, and it impacts our future. So we think about how COVID impacted us with a lack of response and the lack of care into marginalized, vulnerable communities. And I think about how many people in our communities that we lost because there was no plan, and because coronavirus was a hoax. And I think about all of those people we lost in the United States because it wasn't taken seriously. And we already know how vulnerable we are in Indian healthcare. And so these are the types of things, this comes back down to like our basic survival. And so I'm very passionate about all of these topics, you know. But I really think that having a conversation about who you're going to vote for is going to make a bigger difference than listening to a presentation about who these candidates are, especially if this is your first time voting, and maybe you're unsure and maybe you're hesitant. And national news, the media has a lot to do with what stories, you know, get covered and what gets the clicks. And so what that does is it blurs the lines on what should potentially be important for marginalized, vulnerable communities. And I think that that's also the power of having Native journalists working the beat, working and understanding how that story, whatever they're covering, is going to far more impact communities who don't have their story told, which is why we're here. So I think there's multiple layers that we can constantly peel back. But what it ultimately comes down to is voter education. Voter response, and having a stake in our community, investing in our community, and loving our community.
I don't have anything to add. I think that April and Polly covered this really nicely because it's true, especially the way that Polly pointed out in Congressional District 2, where you have two main candidates, where one is Indigenous, Jonathan Nez, who is the Democratic candidate, and then Representative Eli Crane, who is the Republican candidate. And Congressional District 2 was redistricted in 2022. And then when it was redistricted, it went Republican leaning. So now you are in a district where you have the points stacked against you as a Democratic candidate. But right now, according to early polling, they are neck and neck. Jonathan Nez and Eli Crane are neck and neck. And it is going to be those 14 tribal nations within that district that are going to decide who is going to control that district. And I think that's what makes this race so interesting, is because Jonathan Nez understands that. He has like over 18 years of public service. He was the former Navajo Nation president, for crying out loud. So you see him trying to connect not only with his Indigenous constituents, but rural community constituents. He understands that he needs to be able to reach across these aisles to make those connections. And you don't see his opponent doing the same thing or putting in the same legwork. And it really comes down to candidates understanding how tribal nations work on a government to government basis, but also just how Indigenous people think with their community in mind. Because one of the things that I really liked from a conversation that I had with Pima County Recorder Gabriela Casares-Kelly is how she talks about how she doesn't have to see Indigenous voting numbers to know that it's changing within her own community, and that they are talking about voting and that they do care about voting. Oftentimes when it comes to national organizations or party-led voting organizations, they focus on on those numbers. They focus on the statistics behind these voting demographics. But for people who are working and on the ground, connecting with Indigenous voters, understand that it takes time and commitment to build that trust within these communities, to understand that it takes building a meaningful relationship for them to understand why voting matters, for them to understand that civic engagement within their own communities is important. And that's why grassroots advocates and grassroots-led organizations are always going to be the ones that are working to do that, because they know how their communities work. They know how to connect with Indigenous populations, because like April said, they do it with their community in mind. So I think that's one of the biggest differences when it comes to Native voting and understanding how Native votes work and operate.
I just want to add real quick. I also think too, like, oftentimes what happens with Native vote, reporting on the Native vote, is you have a lot of non-Indian journalists who parachute into these communities for these stories. And so they're not really like invested in our communities other than reporting, for like up until the last, couple weeks before election, to be able to get those clicks. And I think that like it is one of those it's one of those areas that they're unfamiliar with. So what happens a lot of times is organizations or people who are on the ground who are doing the work are having to do the Indian 101, and so we're having to teach journalists how to teach them about our communities. And so we're often spending more time talking about the history of how difficult it is before we can actually get to the story, which then, because there's no investment in it, it's not something that their editor is interested in, or it's not in something that that they're going to completely invest in that community. And so then you see how and why Indigenous journalists have an easier time in Indian communities reporting on the Native vote than you do, some of the Associated Press. I mean, and like that's just having like a real legit, like that's real. I think that's another key component as to why grassroots organizations continue to stay like hidden, and they're not part of these national organizations that are mostly working with tribal governments. So there is a disconnect between those larger national organizations working specifically with tribal governments as opposed to constituents who are on the ground, who actually vote. And so that's something that we see. But during voting time, it always is like, on all hands on deck. There are those organizations like Indivisible Thano, Native Arizona Vote is the other one that comes to mind. They're pretty efficient at what they do. This is something that we recognize that has to happen all year round, in order to make some of those impacts when we're talking about the power of Native vote, that it's a continuous effort, and that it's not, just those few weeks or a couple months before a large election.
I feel like we're all telepathic because my questions, you guys literally just went boop, boop, boop. So we have about, just to do a time check, I think 23 minutes left. So I do want to get to audience questions. But just really quick, just to kind of go recapping, April, in your experience, how has your relationships with journalists been during election season? And what are some suggestions on how journalists can build their relationships with you? And then after that, Shandine and Polly, if you want to just kind of talk about general tips for if this is your first time covering this election, how do you want to suggest they make that entry point now, a week before?
I think one of the things that we used to laugh about with Indivisible Thano is we used to play hot potato. We used to play hot potato with journalists. You do it. No, you do it. I went the last time. It's your turn. We would play hot potato quite a bit with incoming requests. And so we learned how to say no. I think like when organizations are, they realize the power of the press. Where I live specifically, we don't we're considered a news desert. We don't have, paper publications. We don't have a tribally run newspaper. We don't have our own, cable network news. We don't have any of that. And so the majority of people who are getting their media, they're getting it on either social media, or if they have access to a free publication online. Most online press publications have paywalls. So like there's all these different, if they're getting their news, they're probably getting it on social media. And so I think about all of those barriers and how our situation is a lot more unique than most because of the ruralness. Connectivity is an issue, and then the distances that we drive. And so I think that my experience with reporters haven't all been bad. I think that there's a lot of very passionate journalists who see the challenges of the Native vote, and in that right, want to be a part of creating great news stories but oftentimes Natives, we are the victims of good intentions. And so we have had to been cognizant of who's reporting and what they're reporting, and those relationships that they're building on some of the other stories that they're writing. And so I think like fast forwarding from when Indivisible Thano first got off the ground, we were in a whirlwind. We didn't know our right foot from our left foot. And I think now we're in a really good position because number one, no one is smarter than us. There's nobody smarter than us, and nothing for us without us. That's the reoccurring theme. And I think that in terms of Native journalists, I think there isn't enough of them. I would like to. It's way different. It's way different. The Pima County Recorder shut down every single journalist who wanted a comment from her last week, but told Shondine Silversmith, anything you need, Shondine. And that's the power of building relationships with the people that you're writing about, having access to people in positions that we could only dream about, right? So I think that for the most part, because I know how to say no now, and I live on the res, so they're really not willing to drive an hour and a half to see what it's really like, So I think that's what also keeps me safe is being on the res.
I think I think that's such a valid point of view, because oftentimes people who haven't covered Indigenous communities before or don't understand that it takes time to build relationships within these communities, expect that they're going to go in and everyone's going to just give them everything they need right away. And sure, I'm sure it happens. I'm sure it happens for really big name journalists like the Associated Press or the Guardian and things like that. And it's because media coverage of Indigenous communities has been so complicated for generations. It has been misrepresenting for generations. But I think now we are in a very unique position as Indigenous journalists to be able to showcase what quality coverage of tribal communities means and looks like. Because you have entities like ICT, and you have people at the Associated Press like Graham Buer, and you have these individuals who have covered Indigenous communities for so long and understand how complicated and hard it can be, showcasing what quality journalism looks like when you invest in these communities, when you take the time to build these relationships in these communities, you take the time to research these communities and understand who they are, it 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 shows in your reporting. Just because I'm Native doesn't mean that I was able to go into the Tohono Nation and automatically know everything that was happening with April's community and her community. Me and April's relationship took years to build. And it took a really long time for both of us to build that trust within each other, to be able to be like, I know that I can give you this information, and I know I can go to you for this information. And it takes time. And I think a lot of non-Indigenous editors and a lot of non-Native reporters don't understand that, because they think that it's as simple as just going into the community, taking all the information they need, and then never going back. But that's not how it should be, and that's not how you build those relationships with tribal communities.
And one of the things that I do want to highlight is one, getting an Indigenous affairs reporter. Like, that's like one of the most important things that you should do, is just get an Indigenous affairs reporter or get an Indigenous affairs editor. And if you can't do that, then you, one, can republish Shindine and I, both of our publications are open to republication. And so that's always an option there. And lastly, it is really about investment. I'm invested in this. This is all I do. This is all I've ever done. I've done Indigenous affairs coverage my entire career. People here in DC and the tribal officials who come here all the time know me. You know, I know all of the people in DC here because I'm invested in this community here. I'm invested in what's happening in DC, and people know that. And so it took me a long time to be able to come into the space that I'm at now, where I'm able to, get to the people that I need to talk to. But it took investment and time. And I think that there is a really great non-Native journalist. Her name is Nora Mabey. She is an Indigenous affairs reporter at the Missoulian, and she's been doing Indigenous affairs coverage for the last 5 years. And she has visited every single Indigenous community in Montana. And she meets with the elected officials there. She meets with the community there. She did a statewide survey to talk with Native readers about the stories that they wanted to see. And so that is the kind of investment that you really have to do in order to do Indigenous affairs coverage. And so it's very challenging for me to be like, there's 1 week left. What do you do?
It's too late, honestly.
It's too late. I don't know what to tell you. It's too late.
That's the fact. too late. I mean, and that's just the reality of it. If you wanted to tell the native vote story properly and seriously, you would have been investing in these type of stories a year ago. You would have been investing when these Indigenous candidates made their presence known in their races, and not a week before the election. Not days before the election. It's honestly, it's too late. And sure, you probably can find a couple of organizations or people who are willing to talk to you to be able to turn something around very quickly. But in reality, like Polly and April said, it takes time and investment to be able to build a relationship that's meaningful, to be able to share the stories that are important, not only for the news, but for these communities. Indigenous communities haven't been able to share their stories at this level for generations. So, of course, they're going to be picky on who they choose to share these stories with. Of course, they're going to be hesitant on who they choose to talk to because they've had their voices taken from them for generations. They finally have that power to be like, no, like April said, if she doesn't want to talk to anybody, she's going to say no. And it's not my job to push her to say yes. If she doesn't want to comment on anything, then I'll respect that and move on and be like, not happening. So
I think too is that like their emergencies are not our emergencies. I think when you're late in the game as a journalist, you're showing up late. Um, you know, Organizations and people on the ground definitely don't owe you anything. You're not invested in their community, you're not invested in this story. That Natives don't owe the press anything. So if you're taking the time to build those relationships and making those connections, I think that's longevity for your career, as opposed to trying to, get a story out in 1 week where it means little to nothing to you and everything to a community that you would be writing about. So our emergencies are their emergencies are not our emergencies.
Thank you. I just wanted to take a second to also just quickly plug IJA's guides, setting up that reporting. All of that is spelled out in those guides, as well as Duncan McHugh's Decolonizing Journalism book, if you can see it. But it's a great resource to start thinking about how you're going to build up those sources if you want to take this seriously as a reporter. I think we have time for one question coming in around hurdles faced in voting in 2024. Which jurisdictions improved most from 2020 and 2022 elections? Any jurisdictions imposing new burdens or hurdles?
Pima County. In 2020, Pima County voted for Gabriela Cáceres Kelly, who is the first Native American to serve in a Pima County-wide seat. She's also my best friend, so of course I'm gonna take a point of personal privilege and plug that in. And she's a co-founding member of Indivisible Tono, and I just kind of want to talk about how things have improved because of her being elected in in the capacity of the Pima County Recorder. I talked a little bit about how the history of the Native vote, specifically for Arizona. 1928 denied the right to vote. 1948 were granted the right to vote. And then you have literacy tests up until the 1970s. So Natives in Arizona have actually only had the right to vote for the last 54 years. It's not, we don't have a head start in that. We're actually really late in the game. So to me, it makes sense why there's continuous barriers and challenges here in Arizona. But the reason why I want to go back to Pima County was because in 2020, the former Pima County Recorder, Efan Rodriguez, she removed the early voting locations from the Pasquayaqui Indian Reservation, and they had to sue to have that early voting site set back up. And the reason why this is big time is because it would cost them a few $1,000s to keep that voting location open, but she dug her heels in, spent thousands and thousands of county taxpayers' dollars to keep that location closed. And then as soon as Pima County, the newly elected Pima County Recorder, as soon as that was one of the first things she did was she reinstated that polling location specific for Pasquayaqui Indian tribe. And I think like the wins within Indian country are so far few and in between. When we have those wins like that, and when we can vote someone who looks like us, who understands the challenges, who's from our same community, and they're in those spaces, and they harness what the power that has been given to them to do something that impacts entire communities. I mean, that still gives me, it makes me very emotional when I think about how impactful just electing this one individual who oversees voter registration and early elections in Pima County. So I think Arizona, Pima County, Gabriela Cáceres Kelly, Pima County Recorder.
So I just wanted to give the example of South Carolina. They have one federally recognized tribe in South Carolina, the Kataba Nation. And one of the things that I talked with their chairman and one of their council members about is like what services they have available on the Kataba Nation, which is, located just outside one of the larger cities in South Carolina. And they don't have a polling location on their tribal lands. And so they don't have a polling location. They don't have a place to register to vote at the county or state level on tribal lands. And so that is, again, a barrier for Native voters. And on top of that, there are a lot of Native voters who would feel more comfortable voting in a polling location where the poll workers look like them. And so that, again, is another, I would say this all the time. My sister used to be a poll worker at our chapter house, and I used to go over there at 7 a.m. every morning and be like, hey, can I get my ballot? And so, just having that like familiarity and like having your family being there and supporting you and, being able to walk you through the process of voting or having somebody from your community be able to do that, I think is really impactful. And in South Carolina, particularly, there is someone who is very like civically engaged with their tribal nation. They go to all the meetings. They're there all the time asking tough questions to the elected officials. And he drives a John Deere lawnmower around. And he doesn't really leave his homelands ever. And so if he was able to vote on tribal lands, he would, but there's no polling location. And so he doesn't vote in statewide or national elections for that reason, but he votes in every single tribal election. And so that is the difference, that having polling locations and having early voting access has for Indigenous nations. And that was the example that Kataba pointed to. They were like, he would vote, but this is a barrier that, exists for him. And so that's just one of the things that I wanted to highlight for folks, is that there are a lot of Indigenous communities that do not have polling locations on their tribal lands. And that is a huge barrier to voting.
I vote in Apache County. I live 6 miles south on Apache County Road 429, in the middle of Steamboat, Arizona on the Navajo Nation. I have covered election day for a couple of years now, and I go out and visit these different polling locations across the Navajo Nation on election day. And let me tell you, it's not easy. The distance between some of these polling locations is ridiculous. This primary election, I visited 10 polling locations and spent 12 hours in my car and drove 200 miles traveling to all of these different polling locations on the Navajo Nation. So when people think that even though there are polling locations and precincts located within tribal community, accessing them isn't easy for a lot of people. It takes time and commitment to plan your time to vote within rural tribal communities, because maybe you don't have a car, maybe it takes 45 minutes one way to get your polling location. There are a lot of different barriers that impact Indigenous voters who live on their tribal lands. It's a whole different experience for them. So, like April pointed out, when you have people who understand that and understand those barriers representing an office that works on voting, helps. It helps you feel seen, it helps you feel heard, and it helps you just understand, like, okay, maybe I'm not crazy that my polling location, it takes me 30 minutes to get there, or I can only vote at the post office or go to the post office during 9 a.m. and 12 p.m. So I'm going to have to figure out when I can go do that. There are just a lot of these unique experiences that do not impact any other demographic in this country. And I think that's what people need to understand. All of these voting barriers that impact Indigenous communities do not exist within other demographics across this country. And that's on purpose.
Thank you, Shondine, and thank you, April and Polly. We are coming to the end of the hour here. We're actually a little over. I know we weren't able to get to a lot of questions. This is a big topic. We wanted to do 2 panels. We were only able to get one ahead of the election. So if there are any other questions, feel free to email and reach out to us for those, any other reporting guides. But yeah, thanks again to our panelists, and thank you everybody that came. And again, happy to answer any questions if you guys want to reach out.
Perfect. Thank you, Christine, and thank you, Shondine, April, and Polly. We appreciate your time and expertise. And I also like to thank our audience. We love to hear your feedback and thoughts about today's roundtable. So we dropped a quick survey in the chat. Please take that, and I'll go ahead and email a recording. But this concludes today's virtual roundtable. Sorry, it's my son. And we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks.